What links a medieval knight on horseback, draped in all that expensive armor, and a modern-day IRS agent sitting in an office?
Huh. That's a great question. I mean, my first thought would be something about authority, or maybe their ability to use the threat of violence to extract resources.
You're close. You're definitely on the right track, but the core link is actually, well, it's obsolescence.
Obsolescence.
Exactly. Both represent a power structure that becomes fundamentally bankrupt when the core arithmetic, what the authors call the returns to violence, completely shifts. The knight was made obsolete by gunpowder,
Yeah.
and the IRS agent, and really the entire nation state, is being made obsolete right now by the microchip.
It's hard to hear that without feeling a little bit of anxiety, isn't it? We're all sort of programmed to believe that the nation state is this permanent, almost moral fact of life.
Of course.
But this deep dive into the sovereign individual is really demanding that we look past that, past the common sense of it, and examine the actual physics of power.
Absolutely. And that's our mission today. We're here to decode these hidden forces the authors call mega-political. We're not talking about elections or parties.
No, this is much bigger.
We mean these seismic, profound causes of change, like a new technology or a shift in climate, that fundamentally determine what kind of political system is even viable.
We're going to show you why this technological shift is ushering in the age of the sovereign individual.
Yeah.
I mean, this book, written decades ago, it predicted the necessity of cyber money. It basically anticipated Bitcoin before it even existed.
And that's not magic. It's just applied logic. The central thesis is, well, it's pretty blunt. Political systems aren't ultimately about moral ideals or who we vote for. They are technological results driven directly by the prevailing logic of violence.
So if the cost of protection changes, the government has to change too.
It must change. There's no other option.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. Let's use the gunpowder analogy to explain this whole mega-political premise. We need a clear visual for feudalism, say around 1000 AD. Right, so imagine this scene. You've got the armored knight on his war horse. He's a highly specialized military asset. Now, you contrast him with a peasant who maybe has a pitchfork, if he's lucky.
Not exactly a fair fight.
Not at all. Violence has extremely high returns for the attacker. And the reason for that is farming. Farming created stationary capital, barns, harvests, fields, things that were really easy to steal, but incredibly hard for one person to defend.
So if the peasant didn't pay the tithe, which was basically just protection money,
Often a third, sometimes even half of everything they produced.
the knight had this overwhelming, localized brute force. His armor, his training, it made him incredibly efficient at the local level.
And as a result, sovereignty back then was completely fragmented. You had countless small authorities, lords, barons, dukes, you name it. Local defense was possible, sure, if you had a castle, but for most people, it was impossible. The logic was simple. High returns to local violence meant localized power.
Then, gunpowder arrives. And this technology does something absolutely incredible. It makes that specialized individual force completely obsolete.
A commoner with a gun could now kill that expensive armored knight. Suddenly, that individual warrior isn't nearly as valuable. And crucially, the castle wall. It now fails completely against cannon fire.
The whole scale of fighting just gets ratcheted up instantly.
Right. Gunpowder weapons were affordable for commoners, yes. But cannons and the logistics for massive armies, that was incredibly expensive. This shift favored leaders who had access to serious financial resources.
Which meant monarchs teaming up with rich merchants.
Exactly. They could buy the huge bronze cannons and just blast their opposition to pieces. Over the next 2 centuries, this is what drives the emergence of the nation-state. It was an institution perfectly designed to fund these huge, centralized militaries.
So the returns to violence went up, meaning bigger was better.
Magnitude of force became way more important than local efficiency. The nation-state was basically a massive war financing and extortion machine for the industrial age, where you had big stationary targets like factories and railroads that needed huge state protection.
And now we hit the microchip revolution.
And the logic reverses completely. The microchip is the new gunpowder, but its effect is the total opposite. It collapses the returns to violence for the big, centralized state.
Okay, that sounds revolutionary. How exactly does information technology collapse the state's power to coerce people?
Because it makes protecting your assets much, much easier, and it makes coercion, extortion by governments or anyone else much more difficult. Think about what the state actually seizes.
Physical things, land, money in a bank, your salary.
Right, physical assets in a specific location. Information technology lets wealth and assets be placed completely outside of any territorial jurisdiction, all secured by encryption.
So the state can still physically grab you, but they can't necessarily grab your assets if those assets don't really exist in a physical place they control.
Precisely. And the authors argue this rests on a fundamental mathematical truth. It is just easier to multiply and secure data, to secure wealth digitally, than it is for an attacker to divide or seize it. A sovereign individual can use tools, multi-sig wallets, DeFi, that make brute force seizure almost impossible without specific knowledge the state can't get. This kind of wealth exists outside the reach of physical control.
That is a staggering implication. If wealth can just escape, what happens to the nation-state as an institution? This brings us to theme 2, the death of the nation-state, and another pretty profound analogy. The book argues the nation-state today is like the late medieval church.
Yeah, a senile, bloated, counterproductive institution. By the end of the 15th century, the church had grown corrupt. It was a drag on the economy. It was absorbing huge amounts of capital in totally unproductive ways, building giant cathedrals, maintaining armies of monks, and demanding tithes from everyone.
It was charging monopoly prices for spiritual services, like salvation, that people were starting to question. And then the printing press shows up around 1450.
And the printing press just mass produces books. It decentralizes information and creates a market for, well, heresy. Suddenly the church loses its monopoly on the Word of God. People could read the Bible for themselves, they could interpret it, they could critique the institution.
Censorship didn't work.
It failed completely. The technology was immediately put to its most subversive use against the ruling monopoly, and it shattered the church's power to extract wealth.
So fast forward to today. The state holds a near monopoly on protection, but it extracts a higher percentage of our output than any sovereignty in history. Taxes are just modern tithes.
And information technology is the new printing press. Encryption, the internet, global connectivity, these things are undermining the state's monopoly. Your income earning potential is now divorced from your physical location. You can work for a company in London while sitting on a beach in Thailand, and your income can be paid in crypto completely outside the local tax net.
The authors call this escaping the tyranny of place. But what about loyalty? I mean, what happens to the whole idea of citizenship?
Citizenship will go the way of chivalry. Think about it. All those chivalric oaths, they were badges of honor until the military purpose behind them became antiquated. The same's happening to citizenship. It was once an asset, something the state gave you in exchange for military service and taxes.
But now,
the individual is no longer an asset of the state. The individual is now a customer of government.
which leads to this idea of commercialized sovereignty. If the roads are bad and the taxes are high, the sovereign individual just shops for freedom somewhere else. You subscribe to a government like it's Netflix.
And that customer, with all their digital tools and skills, now has the ultimate power of exit. And that is the fundamental threat. The nation-state can no longer rely on its citizens being physically locked into its tax jurisdiction.
Which brings us to a really uncomfortable truth about inequality and the rise of what the book calls the cognitive elite. If the state can't tax everyone and the most productive people can leave, who's left holding the bag?
Well, this requires us to look at the history of labor. The 20th century was actually a very unusual time. It saw a big trend toward equality because the industrial age prioritized input work, just showing up, doing factory labor, standardized physical tasks. That model naturally raised the earnings of unskilled workers.
But the information age is reversing that trend. It's becoming profoundly less egalitarian. Why is that?
Because economic output today is driven by output work and pure mental ability. It's the scalability of genius. If you're a programmer and you create some breakthrough algorithm, your output isn't just 10 times better. The reward is massive, and it's scalable globally. You're competing in a world market against everyone doing that same job.
And the rewards only flow to the very best.
The benefits flow most obviously to the cognitive elite, the top 5 or 10% of skilled people.
So what happens to everyone else? The people whose jobs were, protected by location and bureaucracy in the old system.
The result is massive inequality of outcome. The book argues that societies that were taught to expect high consumption and income equality for low-skilled work are going to face, severe demotivation and insecurity. I mean, look at entire industries, data entry, middle management jobs that are just rapidly being automated away.
These were the jobs the old system protected. And now, as that protection vanishes, the old tools unions, tariffs, heavy redistribution, they all become obsolete.
Which leads, maybe inevitably, to what the authors call an unemployable underclass. and really intense reactionary sentiment. We're seeing that backlash right now, that nationalist, anti-technology anger. It's a moral anachronism, trying to solve 21st century problems with 19th century ethics, believing the state should enforce equality when the technology makes global competition inescapable.
Okay, so let's address the big question, the counter-argument. Can we use democratic means, voting, regulations, banning encryption, to stop this collapse and save the nation state?
That's the key skeptical question, right? Surely if enough people vote for something, the state can enforce its will. Can we just vote our way out of this?
The author's response is stark. You cannot vote against physics.
Politics is downstream of technology.
Exactly. Mega political shifts, the kind driven by technology, they alter the very conditions under which violence pays. They aren't subject to conscious political control. Trying to ban encryption to save the tax base is exactly like the church trying to ban the printing press 500 years ago.
All you do is ensure that the technology gets put to its most subversive use, and that the most capable people will just use it somewhere else.
And as these nation-states get weaker and more financially brittle, what's their inevitable response when they start losing their tax base?
They often become predatory. This is the real danger you need to prepare for. The book points to the last days of the Roman Empire, which, as it was collapsing, started squeezing the remaining population with penal taxes on anyone who tried to flee.
A desperate state treating its citizens like assets to be held for ransom.
Precisely. So the choice becomes pretty clear. Adapt or get squeezed dry. Be a sovereign individual or be a subject who is financially trapped.
So what's the adaptation strategy? What should we be thinking about right now?
It's basically twofold. Strategy one is about your assets. You need to own assets that are immune to this kind of predation, things lodged in cyberspace, in cyber money. Physical goods, land, traditionally taxed salaries, they're all increasingly vulnerable. Digital assets are not.
Like strategy two.
Migration. You have to be willing to exercise your power of exit from high-tax jurisdictions. And this is where the simple math is just so compelling. The opportunity cost of staying put is staggering for a high earner.
Give us the numbers.
Okay, think about it like this. Paying just an extra $5,000 a year in excess tax, just $5,000, costs a high earner $2.4 million in lifetime net worth, and that's assuming a pretty modest 10% annual return. That massive opportunity cost compels rational people to shop for jurisdictions that offer them a better deal. In the near future, the idea that income tax relies on voluntary compliance is going to completely fail. Governments will be forced to compete like corporations for customers.
Okay, let's wrap this up. We are in the middle of a massive global transformation. We are moving from the age of nations, which was a peculiar, relatively short period of history, to the age of sovereign individuals. And this whole thing is driven by the collapse of the returns to violence, which will ultimately destroy the nation-state just as surely as gunpowder destroyed the church's monopoly.
And if you understand this logic of violence, the chaos we see in the news, the rise of global crime, breakdown of order, the nationalist rhetoric, it all becomes entirely predictable. It's not random.
Here is the final thought, the ultimate irony of nationalism for you to mull over. The authors argue the modern nation-state is just too large to warrant individual sacrifice. From a strictly biological perspective, any act of sacrifice you might make for a nation of tens or hundreds of millions of people has an effect on your family's survival, your inclusive fitness, that is so diluted it's like a spit in the ocean.
Which means, in the age of the sovereign individual, loyalty to the modern nation is not a logical choice for survival. It's a dying myth that makes people subject to extraction, rather than masters of their own destiny.
To understand the invisible forces shaping our world and to prepare your assets and your skills for this new age, subscribe to Nonfiction Insights right now.
Click the video on the left. Seriously, hit that logo circle. We are building the smartest community on YouTube, and we want you in it.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. See you next time.